Speak. Okay. You're the only one that can. Good afternoon and welcome. I call the Standing Committee on Veterans Affairs to order, and we have today. My name is Rafa Di Costanzo. I'm the MLA for Clayton Park West, and I'm the chair here today. We are receiving a presentation from the Commissionaires of Nova Scotia today. I will start by asking the committee members to introduce themselves, starting with Ms. Roberts.
Hello, I'm Lisa Roberts, the MLA for Halifax Needham. Glad to be with you.
Murray Ryan, MLA for Northside Westmount.
Good afternoon, welcome. Kim Maslin, MLA for Queens Shelburne.
I'm Ben Jessam. I represent Hammonds Plains, Lucasville.
Good afternoon, everyone. Brendan McGuire, Halifax Atlantic.
Good afternoon. Bill Horn, Waverly Fall River Beaverbank area.
Welcome all. Hugh McKay for Chester St. Margaret's. Beautiful Chester St. Margaret's.
Thank you. That's right. I just wanted to say a couple of things. The washrooms are just outside, if you have seen them, in the anteroom. And in case of emergency, we will leave and meet on Granville Street and proceed to Grand Parade. Hopefully we do not need to do that, and it's never happened to me yet, so I'm very glad. So if I may ask everyone to check their phones to make sure they're on silent. And just, the clerk just explained that if you don't mind waiting until I acknowledge your name so the light will come on your microphone before you speak. And I would like the presenters to, I welcome the presenters, and if they can introduce each other, or who would like to introduce? Perfect. Commander Marjorie.
Good afternoon.
Sorry.
Good afternoon.
Commander Hickey, I apologize.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today to have this opportunity to discuss the role played by commissionaires who work in this province at a variety of sites in a variety of locations. We plan to tell you a bit about the kind of work that commissionaires do and to provide you with some understanding of our company, Commissionaires Nova Scotia. My name is Marjorie Hickey. I'm the current chair of the Board of Governors of Commissionaires Nova Scotia. I'm a partner at the law firm of McGuinness Cooper. I've been a lawyer in Halifax for over 35 years, and I've also been a naval reservist for over 35 years, having served as the commanding officer of our local Naval Reserve Division, HMC, a Scotian, among other positions. I've been on the Board of Governors of Commissionaires Nova Scotia for over 20 years, and I'm truly proud to serve with 15 other governors who come from military and RCMP backgrounds predominantly, but we also have several non-military and non-RCMP members of our board to bring the community perspective and to bring the appropriate matrix of skills to our board. Together, our board oversees the work of the staff of Commissionaires Nova Scotia, who's led by our CEO, Jeff Hamilton. So I'm just going to say a few words about each of our presenters here today, and then I'll be turning it over to Jeff in a short moment. Wonderful. So Jeff Hamilton is our CEO, having joined us at Commissionaires Nova Scotia about a year and a half ago. Prior to working with us, he worked for 3.5 years in Myanmar, where he was the CEO of a security firm serving UN agencies. And before that, he developed an agroforestry project in the South Sudan. He began his career in the Royal Canadian Navy 23 years ago and is still active in the Naval Reserve, where he serves as a commander. To Jeff's right is Steve Graham. Steve served 38 years with the RCMP in British Columbia, Ontario, PEI, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia in operations, staff, and command roles. He is the past commanding officer of PEI, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia divisions, and retired as the deputy commissioner responsible for RCMP services in Ontario, Quebec, Newfoundland, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and PEI. He was busy. He's been a governor with Commissionaires Nova Scotia since 2011, and he serves on a number of our committees and currently serves in the role of vice chair of the board. And to my far right, we have Corinne MacLellan. Corinne is active in the areas of community, government, and media relations, marketing, communications, corporate engagement, public affairs, and event production for some 25 years now. Corinne serves as Senior Vice President with M5 Public Affairs and is a communications principal with Group ATN. Corinne has maintained a diverse cross-sectoral portfolio with M5 focused on transportation, aquaculture, First Nations, and infrastructure development. She was recently appointed an honorary lieutenant colonel with the Halifax Rifles by the Minister of National Defence, Harjit Singh. She is a former in Canada representative for the Belgian government and communications advisor to the Assembly of First Nations regionally. She also, in addition to our board, serves on the Army Museum of Halifax Citadel's board. So we are your presenters collectively this afternoon. The plan for me is to just say a few short words at the beginning to give a bit of an overview of our company, and then Jeff will follow up with greater detail that we hope will be of some interest to you, and Steve and Corinne will chime in as appropriate, and we're certainly open to being interrupted at any time for any questions along the way.
Actually, we normally have you present, just give us some opening remarks, and then we'll pass the questioning to start with the PC to the NDP and then to the Liberal. And I
Okay.
will be doing the list of who's asking the next question. So you just do your opening remarks, and
Okay.
then I will take care of the rest.
Certainly.
Thank you.
So just to give you a broad overview of Commissionaires, the core, as we call it, the core of Commissionaires, is really a global network of social mandate enterprises dedicated to providing meaningful employment for veterans. And when we use the word veterans, we're speaking of veterans of both military and RCMP backgrounds. The organization globally was first founded in the United Kingdom in 1859. In Nova Scotia, it became a not-for-profit corporation incorporated by an act of the Legislative Assembly in 1937. It's headquartered in Halifax, and as I mentioned, we've got a board of governors of 16 governors. We are 100% self-funded through the operations that we conduct. And we are part of a broader federation. There are 15 other divisions nationwide who have similar mandates to provide meaningful employment for veterans. So we are one small piece of a national organization. And I'm going to turn it over now to our CEO, Jeff Hamilton, to carry on with some further details that we hope you will be of interest in.
Definitely. Mr. Hamilton.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the members of the committee for the invitation and allowing us to introduce ourselves a little bit. I'm going to start with, I guess, what we call the basic facts of Commissionaires. Often we end up having to dwell on the basic facts because I think it's safe to say that almost everyone knows what a commissionaire is, but not everyone knows about Commissionaires as an organization. So I'm very happy to be in a room of people who are probably a little bit more familiar about us as an organization and as a not-for-profit. But I will run through the basic facts notwithstanding. So we are the largest private security provider and the largest private employer of veterans in Nova Scotia. That's equally true of Commissionaires across the country. There are 1,400 Commissionaires here in Nova Scotia, part of that federation of 22,000 across Canada. Here in Nova Scotia, 64% of our Commissionaires are veterans. The remainder would be family members of veterans, people with specific technical backgrounds that we require to access, and often members of or former members of police or emergency services who aren't technically speaking veterans within our mandate, but nevertheless are very relevant, I think, to the work we do. We have an 80% retention rate, so that's last year's number. It's traditionally a little bit higher, but that's compared to a security industry rate of about, say, 50 to 10%. In fact, I can say as somebody with a background in security on the private sector side, we don't speak about retention rates. We talk about turnover rates, and the turnover rate is often sort of between 50 and 200%, really, depending on the firm you're talking about. It's quite astonishing. So the fact that we have an 80% retention rate is alarmingly good. Here in Nova Scotia, we have $35 million in annual gross revenue, and I'll talk a little bit more about where that comes from and how our contracts are derived. And you'll see there a sticker. We've just been certified again as one of Canada's best top 300 employers by Forbes for 2020. We've been on that list for 5 years now, and the only security company on that list for those years. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the sort of veterans that we help. I think there exists in folks' minds a stereotype of sorts about what a commissionaire is and what their background is. And from the perspective of someone who's joined and has learned about the organization a lot over the last couple of years, I wanted to sort of share the range of veteran we support. I would say that the traditional career path, if you will, of a commissionaire in the past, perhaps up until about 10 years ago, was this pension bridge veteran. So there was a real sort of career path of folks who would join the military. They would serve for 20 years and they would get a 40% pension. Not enough to live on, but enough that they could return to their home communities of Spring Hill or Yarmouth or wherever they were from where there wasn't a military presence, go back to their families and work with commissionaires. And they would make enough money to sort of top up their pension until they reached the age of 65 when CPP and OAS would kick in and they could retire in financial security. Now, often, many of those folks will continue to work for us at that point, and that's when we bleed into the next category, the not ready to retire veterans, the folks who financially secure, they've made all their arrangements, they're ready to go, the house is paid off, and they try it for 6 months and it just doesn't stick. So we got a lot of failed retirees working in the Commissionaires Corps, and they're our bread and butter. I would say these are the folks that really make the organization what they are. They could not stop working if they tried. They, in fact, have tried and could not stop working, so they come back to us. And what they're looking for in the Commissionaires is sort of a sense of community, a sense of purpose, like what they had when they were in the military or the police, and a familiar work environment with colleagues who are familiar to them. We do, of course, have certain commissionaires who are veterans who just are in financial need. Folks who may have served for only 4 or 5 years for whatever reason, chose not to stay in the military long enough to get a pension, had tried different jobs over the course of their life, but as anyone who's been in the military can attest to, once you've sort of been uprooted and begun the path of moving around and being posted, it's hard to kind of get landed anywhere again. It's hard to get a route, and some folks find themselves late in life without a pension or financial ability to retire. And it's difficult to find work as an older person in the workforce, and we provide a place for them as well. I think that's probably the type of veteran a lot of folks have in mind when they think of commissionaires. I can attest that that's actually a relative minority of the workforce that we have. We are seeing an increasing number of these so-called second career veterans. So these are folks who are, I suppose, kind of like the previous category, but these are the ones who are just leaving the military. They've done their 5 or 10 years. They don't have a pension. What they're looking for is another job that they can set themselves up for retirement, make some money, and really start a second career. So we're trying to adapt as an organization to provide opportunities for these second career veterans. And we'll talk a little bit later about the sort of business lines we offer that are trying to appeal to that audience. We do, of course, have some folks who are medically accommodated, either through operational stress injuries like PTSD or physical disabilities. As an example, we have a chap who works with us at the Halifax Harbour Bridges, who has a service dog, Thunder, who works with them. And he's one of our managers there, fantastic. Within that accommodation, he's exactly what we want. But there's not a lot of security companies in particular, but employers in general are often reluctant to provide employment for folks who are accommodated by a service dog. And family is an increasing area of focus for us, and in fact, it's a discussion current within our national mandate, whether that should include family of veterans specifically and family of serving veterans or serving service members. Often folks who are in the military and being posted around the country every 3 or 6 years, there's what we in the military used to call a trailing spouse. And that trailing spouse is having to sort of quit and find a job every 3 or 6 years. It's very difficult. Well, everywhere where there's a base and where there's military, there's also commissionaires, and we want to be able to provide support for them as well, and do in many cases. I mentioned a little bit about our contracts before. We are, as Marjorie mentioned, 100% self-funded through our operations, which makes us sort of an unusual not-for-profit organization. We do no fundraising. We issue no charitable receipts. We just negotiate contracts with our clients and operate on a not-for-profit basis with our revenue of $35 million. The federal right of first refusal, as it's called, accommodates about half of that, 49%. So the right of first refusal is our arrangement with the federal government that has been in existence for many decades now, that essentially gives commissionaires as an organization the right to have a first say on whether or not they take work under a national master standing offer to do security services for the federal government. It's through a rate structure that's very transparent, very thoroughly negotiated by Treasury Board and PSBC every year. Effectively, we open our books in excruciating detail. We're going through it right now if I sound pained by that, but it is a very thorough process, and they make sure that through this arrangement we're not operating at a profit and we're not subsidizing the commercial work that we compete with. Two things the federal government's very sensitive to for obvious reasons. That accounts for about half of what we do in Nova Scotia. The remainder is all contracted through commercial procurement processes, including the work we do for the province. Guarding contracts, these can be long-term contracts, they can be seasonal. We do a lot of seasonal work at the Halifax Port Authority in support of the cruise ships, for example, or at the national parks. Or short-term, we do quite a volume of short-term work, whether it's in response to events or contractor escorts and similar work. But we do a full range of guarding work. And as the next slide can speak to, we actually provide a lot of services outside of what you might consider to be stereotypical or traditional commissionaires work. The first square there, security solutions, kind of speaks to what people have in mind when they say a commissionaire. That is access control, security rounds, runs the whole gamut really, because some of the work we do is we call use of force work, where the person is not armed exactly, but ready to defend themselves, and that's in support of the federal courts and some other sensitive areas. But also the traditional commissionaires fall in that field. Fingerprinting and identification services, a relatively new service that's been rolled out over the last few years. We do have a retail outlet just down the road now on Barrington in Scotia Square or opposite Scotia Square that perhaps you'll see the signage for soon. We've just moved there. Effectively, we can provide criminal record checks and fingerprinting and passport photos and all the services to support issuance of identification. We do have some national clients for that as well, some large national employers who contract with us to do all of that background processing and screening pre-employment and then to issue actual identification cards for the employer on behalf of the employer. Investigations and support to law enforcement is a really growing area for us. So it's an area, in fact, that in Halifax we've pioneered across the country at Halifax Regional Police. We have 40 commissionaires working there, and the police themselves are very happy to say that everything that happens in that building that doesn't require a badge or a gun or both is done by a commissionaire. A lot of administrative back-end support, everything from processing remands and issuing summonses is done by commissionaires there, including criminal record checks. The investigations capability is one that we're doing an increasing amount of now for private investigations, internal investigations, and we hope to be able to do some investigations in support of police complaints commissions and similar public bodies that require third-party trusted organization to conduct investigations for them. Perhaps call on Deputy Commissioner Graham to speak to that, because as a former RCMP member, he does have a fair amount of knowledge in that specific area.
Mr. Graham.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jeff, for that. Certainly non-core policing is an area, all police services in the country. Policing is a very expensive enterprise. It requires high skill set, but there are certain areas within it that different approaches can be taken which are cost effective and appropriate. And it can run the gambit from things like a crime scene, protecting a crime scene for an extended period of time while investigators continue to do their work and so on, to provide that kind of security. We have a contract in Atlantic Canada for detention guards and services, and that's for all the cell blocks across the province to provide that kind of support and work. We have dispatch in some locations, and certainly escorts, site access, by law enforcement is possible, parking enforcement, all of those things. So beyond just, I shouldn't say beyond just investigation, but there are a lot of areas that would take pressure off police services that we feel we have a very good skill set and a great group of people that could support that kind of work.
All right. And do we have Ms. MacLellan, would you like to add something, or just answering questions? I'm sorry, Ms. MacLellan. I'm
No,
sorry.
that's
okay.
It's okay.
All right, so we'll open it now to questions. I apologize. Sorry, Mr. Geoffrey. Mr. Hamilton, I'm sorry.
I apologize for starting the volleyball at this end of the
okay.
table.
I
I
was
just did
moving.
want to have somebody speak to that who has a little bit more experience in policing specifically than I do.
Sorry.
The key, I guess, with all of these service areas that we're diversifying, and we call these diversification areas, the ones that aren't traditionally commissionaires, that includes training. We do a lot of first aid training, an increasing amount. Is that they relate very closely to trades and skills that are required by folks in the military and the RCMP in the course of their service, and we're trying to provide higher paying work that speaks to those skills. This is a quick map of where we work. So those red dots are the sites of where commissionaires are providing security across the province, and the next slide is where we live. So obviously there's a fair amount of overlap. But I guess the point I want to make with this slide in particular is that although where we work is often in urban areas, as you can see quite a bit around HRM in particular, where we live tends to be in rural areas. So I guess that speaks to the extent to which Commissionaires is an organization that is supporting rural areas and rural economies, even though the work is often contracted in the cities themselves. And again, that's sort of an effect of our veterans. When they leave the military and they move home, they really want to move home. They want to move back to where they're from, and we provide work that allows them to do that. So having introduced the basic facts first that I suppose you were all familiar with, these are the surprising ones that I suppose many people would not be inclined to think. At the top of the list, I guess, is a common misperception. 50% of our commissionaires are below the ordinary age of retirement. In fact, the bulk of our workforce is between the age of 45 and 65. 21% are female, which doesn't sound like an incredible statistic, except when you compare it to our feedstock of releasing armed forces members, who tend to be about 14% female, and the security industry writ large tends to be more closer to 12%. So we are a standout in that category. We are accommodating, as I mentioned, 13% of our workforce with accommodated disability of some sort, obviously in jobs that allow them for those disabilities to be accommodated. 13% of our workforce is Indigenous, which is a surprising one to us, but I suppose not so much when you consider how many of our employees work in rural areas. And that compares to only about 3% of the Nova Scotia workforce. We have done an economic impact assessment, had one commissioned by Group ATN, because we did want to know what is the tangible impact of Commissionaires Nova Scotia, and we really wanted to avoid having one of these pie-in-the-sky sort of economic impacts, for every dollar spent you could send a man to the moon sort of thing. So it was conducted actuarially by an economist who worked very closely with the province. And the finding is surprising, though. It's because we're based in Nova Scotia and because we're not-for-profit, for every dollar contracted with us, we generate about 20% more provincial tax revenue. Create 18% more employment for Nova Scotians, and we increase household incomes of our employees by 19% as compared to a non-Nova Scotian or for-profit security company. And the last point there is one I wanted to add on to what I mentioned earlier about those folks who work for us who are not ready to retire. In almost all cases, we find that those are folks who are happy to work for Commissionaires who wouldn't typically work for any other security company. And the impact of that is that, well, it's twofold. On the one hand, we find that when, for example, we lose a competitive tender and the private sector companies are able to badge over, they generally expect to be able to badge over the workforce, as they call it. They just sort of go in and recruit the guys who are working there now. They expect to be able to do about 80% of a badge over rate. And when it comes to Commissionaires, the industry is aware that that badge over rate is typically more like 20%, because a good chunk of that workforce is just doesn't really want to do anything else for any other organization. The net effect of that is that we really do sort of grow the workforce of Nova Scotia. When you look at the number of the employees we have, the number who could be financially retired, the number who would not otherwise choose to work if they weren't with Commissionaires, and you sort of aggregate that across the whole Nova Scotia workforce, it's about 0.1% of Nova Scotia workforce is effectively Commissionaires who could otherwise retire, which, when you think about it, is a pretty considerable and surprising number. Some of the challenges we're facing now, I've already spoken to the changing needs of veterans, the changing types of veterans we're trying to serve, and the sort of diversification we're trying to do to be able to reach them. Supporting veterans in specific rural areas is a big focus for us. And if you look back at that where we work, where we live slide, there were a couple of gaps in the South Shore in particular and around Guysborough County where we don't have a presence and where we would like to be able to provide work for veterans in those areas. We know there are veterans there who would be perfectly happy to work for us, and we want to be able to serve them. The federal right of first refusal that I mentioned earlier is a process that gets renewed on a 10-year basis, and we're sort of at the end of that 10 years now, and we're going through that process now, and it is a challenge for us to do that because, of course, anyone in the security industry on the private sector side would like to think that they should get a piece of that work, so the government comes under a lot of lobbying, and we need to stay ahead of that as well and continuously demonstrate our value as a not-for-profit partner. We do need to stay ahead of the minimum wage, and we're happy to see that the minimum wage was increased recently to go up $1, and that's fantastic. What that should translate to in our ideal world is that all of our commissionaires' wages go up $1, and that's it's a little bit more complicated than that because we are dealing with over 200 separately negotiated commercial contracts. We have to go around and stay ahead of that, including with the province. So that's a challenge for us at the moment. And workers' compensation, I think it's a challenge for everyone for reasons that I don't think I need to bore anyone with here, and I don't want to turn this into a complaint about WCB session because they provide a valuable service. But we are aware that competitors based outside of Nova Scotia are able to come in and bid on work against us and do not have to fall under the WCB regime, which means that in effect they get a 3 to 3.5% budget advantage over us, which is a real problem for us. And this is my last slide, I swear. These are the initiatives we're working on at the moment. Engagement with the Nova Scotia Health Authority is a big one for us. We formerly did a lot of work with hospitals in Nova Scotia when the separate district authorities were pre-amalgamated. You've probably seen a lot of coverage recently about security issues around healthcare in Nova Scotia. Those weren't stories you saw 5 years ago, and I'll let you draw your own conclusions about why that may be. But now that there's new leadership at NSHA, we're able to begin grassroots discussions with folks at the hospitals themselves, the facility managers, about being able to provide them with the services they feel they need. And we'll be engaging with the new CEO, Brendan Carr, as well soon. We're looking at a commercial occupational long-term disability insurance program as an alternative to WCB. We are voluntary participants in that program, and we see that a commercial program of long-term disability and occupational insurance would provide better value for our commissionaires. Effectively, it would insure them against any type of injury or sickness or illness, not just work-related ones, at no additional cost, effectively, the way the numbers break out in comparison to WCB. So that's something we're working on very closely with, including with our partners in the province, because it is, at the moment, a specific contractor requirement that we be with WCB. So we're hoping to have our program assessed and reviewed and that it will be signed off as an effective alternative. We're delivering those new service lines that we discussed earlier, ID services, non-core policing, and investigations. So we're working with the province on how we can provide those services to them as well. Certainly engaging all of our clients right now with the recent change to minimum wage and how that should impact the wages of their commissionaires under contract. And we're working with staff at the provincial level to seek some clarification on there's a provision in the Nova Scotia Procurement Manual that allows sole sourcing to not-for-profits, but the practice within the public service is to not use that provision except under sort of extraordinary circumstances, and it's not really clear to anyone we've spoken to what those circumstances are or who makes the decision. So we would like to suggest that we should be one of those circumstances and are continuing those discussions. And just in general, I suppose more generally about social mandate preferences, there is in the Public Service Commission an explicit preference for hiring of veterans. We'd like to suggest there should be a specific preference for contracting with veteran supporting organizations as a sort of social mandate enterprise basis. We'd like to see more weighting in technical scoring of RFPs in particular that address that area. So those are some areas that we're currently in discussions with. And that is my last slide. Madam Chair, thank you for your patience. I know that was more than 5 minutes, at least I suspect.
No, I think you gave us wonderful information, and I look forward to the questions from my colleagues. And we will start the questions with the PC party. And we normally have a question and a follow-up with it. So, and then we move on to the NDP and then the Liberals, and we'll go in a circle until about 3:45, when we will ask you to give your final remarks, and then we will do the business for the committee after that. Thank you very much, and we will start with Ms. MacLellan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. I know I speak for myself and colleagues around when we say how fortunate we are at the legislature to have those great men and women that protect the House and protect us every day. Extremely professional, wonderful people, so we're very fortunate to have them there. And when you spoke of the family connection, which veterans do we help, I have a connection to that too, because my daughter was a commissionaire when she followed her RCMP husband to the north. So wonderful, wonderful work you folks are doing. You mentioned in your presentation that 64% of the employees are veterans. Have you had any difficulties in hiring veterans, especially now where you're looking at all the diversification? Are you able to fill those? Are you having any difficulty in hiring veterans?
Mr. Hamilton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, thank you for that question, because obviously we have to remain attractive as an employer to veterans, and that's really one of our strategic goals, is to be not just an employer, but an employer of choice of sorts for veterans. And what that comes down to is being able to provide work that's appealing to them. So that traditional audience is, I don't want to say dying off, but that traditional type of veteran is less common these days, and we're seeing younger ones, and that's what the diversification initiative is all about. In terms of are we having trouble, it's something we're constantly seized with, but I think you would find that 64% number, at least in Nova Scotia, has been about steady for the last few years.
Ms. MacLellan, again.
My next question is, the last time your organization presented to our committee, your goal was to increase contracts in healthcare, marine, and energy security services in Nova Scotia, as well as become the choice for non-core policing services and security training in Nova Scotia. I'm just wondering, how successful do you feel you folks have been in that?
Mr. Hamilton.
Well, I guess we don't have the hospital contract, which was one in the end. The discussions at the last board meeting or the last committee meeting, I believe it was up in the air about how that was going to be contracted. In the end, it was one big RFP for the whole province, not a perfect RFP. I would suggest that didn't necessarily weight experience and capacity to deliver, or was not inquisitive about the ability of the providers selected to deliver at the pay rates they were proposing. And that's led to a lot of the current trouble that we're seeing. So we've been unsuccessful in that, and our hope is to become successful in it by engaging the NSHA now that there's been some reorganization there. On the marine side, we're doing very well. Actually, the Halifax Port Authority, we do a lot of work with, and in Ceres, New Star Terminal, we do quite a bit of marine work at the moment that we're quite happy with. And the last one on that list,
Energy.
And the energy sector. Obviously, there have been some twists and turns in the energy sector in the last couple of years. We're still very well positioned. We are, in fact, this is one of the red dots that didn't appear on the Where We Work slide, because it's a relatively recent addition. We're doing some work with ExxonMobil in their site in Guysborough County, and there's a lot of other activity related to energy in Guysborough County that we're keeping our eyes on for sure.
Thank you, Ms. MacLellan. We move on to the NDP, Ms. Roberts.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the presentation. Because we are the Veterans Affairs Committee, but we don't typically include RCMP veterans in our definition of veterans. I'm interested to know, of the 64% veterans, what percentage of that is Canadian Forces versus RCMP or other law enforcement?
Mr. Hamilton.
I don't have the exact number at hand, but I could certainly follow up. My understanding is that it's a relatively small, we're in the single-digit percents for RCMP. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. There's relatively more military presence in Nova Scotia, and the sort of work we've done has not traditionally reached out to the RCMP as effectively, I think, as military veterans. So we see a lot of opportunity in those diversification business lines.
Ms. Roberts for a supplementary.
Thank you, and maybe this is less of a supplementary, more of a going off in a slightly other direction, but you use the term social mandate enterprise. I'm more used to hearing about social enterprise. I guess I understand that your social mandate is to employ veterans, but can you speak a little bit more to that, I guess that term, and also to exactly how you define yourself and how that social mandate rolls out through the organization?
Mr. Hamilton.
I'm not sure that there's actually much of a distinction between the two terms. I think we do speak in terms of our social mandate all the time internally. We're going through a national strategic planning process that's reviewing our social mandate to maintain its currency, and that's where the discussion about whether we're going to also support family members of serving members, is that within our mandate lines, which has always been traditionally about veterans. But we're certainly very much a mandate-driven organization. The social mandate is at the core of what we do.
Thank you very much. We'll move it on to the Liberal Caucus and Mr. Maguire.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here today. I just had a couple questions just going through the information here. You obviously employ a lot of Nova Scotian veterans. It's a great organization. I'm just wondering, what is the average salary or pay for the on-the-ground commissionaires?
Mr. Hamilton.
Actually, there's no meaningful average, but I can tell you where the spike in the wage rate is right now, and we're not happy about where it is, to be honest. If you sort of stacked up all of our pay rate by hours worked, it's sort of in the $14 an hour range, $13 to $14 an hour range, which is getting scarily close to the minimum wage. And if you went back 30 years, we were paying a premium of about 30% above minimum wage. And now we're sort of getting closer to 10%, and we have a lot of work to do to keep up.
So,
Mr. Maguire.
for a follow-up, how do you determine your pay, your hourly wage, the structure, and how do you determine and what decides the raises, and what triggers a review of your salary? Is it all based on the contract, the money you're getting from the contracts, or?
Mr. Hamilton.
That's right. It's all contractually derived. So on the NMSO, on that federal right of first refusal, that's the process is very transparent and open, and the federal government effectively dictates what the pay rates will be. We're making arguments to them that because of the recent increase in the minimum wage, that it should go up. For the commercial contracts, it works much like for any commercial company. We're just sort of bidding on RFPs without a profit margin. And so we set it accordingly, and those contracts will dictate whether the increase is cost of living adjusted every year or a fixed amount every year, or whether we just have to sort of eat the salary or wage increases over the life of the contract if we built it in.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. We'll move on back to the PC Caucus, and we have Mr. Ryan.
Thank you very much. First of all, once again, welcome. It's great to have members of our veteran forces here who have served our country so well and continue to keep our community safe. Same with retired members of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Force. My question is with regard, earlier in your presentation, you touched on your contract is soon coming to an end with the federal government as far as going into negotiations for continuation of that. And I believe you said it was of a 10-year duration. So I'm just curious, where do you see pressures coming related to that? And is there anything we can do on our end provincially to help you in your efforts to secure and at least maintain the level of the quality of the agreement that you currently have with the government?
Mr. Hamilton.
I would say I don't know that there are any specific pressure areas on it, or at least unique ones. I think it's all of the usual ones that you would expect. They have to do a broad industry consultation. They have to satisfy stakeholders within government. And to be honest, we're outside of a lot of the process. We see it working remotely. The file recently transferred from Treasury Board to Veterans Affairs. So now our RFR formally falls under the Veterans Affairs Canada Department. So there was a bit of internal churn, I would think, sort of related to that transfer and gaining some situational awareness of the file. We understand that we're relatively close to the end of the process and that things may look positive, but if you're asking what could be done to support that, I would think a letter from the committee would not go unwelcome, at least by us.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. And for a supplementary from Mr. Ryan.
Thank you. The last time that your organization was here, you expressed some interest in wanting a similar type of first right of refusal here in the province, and I was just wondering where that may be at currently, if you've made any progress towards that or any further negotiations, discussions.
Mr. Hamilton.
The discussions, I think, followed a course that you might have anticipated. So we don't have a right of first refusal at the moment, and I think we have to be realistic about whether or not that's something the government's prepared to offer. If they are, I'm certainly all for it. But I do think that there's some things we can do within the existing procurement manual around sole sourcing to not-for-profits and existing policies around social procurement and technical weighting in RFPs to support social procurement that are promising avenues for us as well.
Thank you again. And we move on to the NDP. Ms. Roberts again.
Thank you. Thanks for all the information you're providing. I am interested in this slide, I guess, from Commissionaires offering 30% approximately above minimum wage rates to now being relatively close to minimum wage with just a 10% margin. And of course, we welcome the $1 increase to the minimum wage that is coming this spring. And so I imagine that range is going to get even tighter at that point. Understanding that you're, I imagine continuously bidding on contracts, and those contracts are of different durations. How is it that your wages have slipped behind in terms of, offering a premium above minimum wage?
Mr. Hamilton.
I think the answer to that may be sort of contained in your question itself. It's complicated to negotiate, to make promises on the basis of a bid in response to an RFP. It is then hard, after you've been awarded a 3 or 5 year contract, to go back and say, hey, the price has gone up. And I think it's traditionally because we paid so far above minimum wage that there was no sort of linkage in our clients' minds between the minimum wage and what Commissionaires were getting paid. They didn't occur to them that, an experienced security person in their 50s might be getting paid the same or close to the same as a high school kid serving ice cream at the beach in the summer. And because there's that traditional, I would say, separation of those two thoughts, the impact of the minimum wage and how that's crept up, it's been hard to explain to them that, yes, this is a very real thing that impacts us now. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, relatively easier for us to ignore, and I think perhaps we may not have been as agile as we could have been in negotiating with government and dealing with the procurement organizations, not just provincial procurement, but large corporate procurement. It can be difficult to get them to do anything other than buy at the lowest price that they can, and that's the challenge we've been up against.
Ms. Roberts for a supplementary.
Thank you. And of course, minimum wage is ultimately, ought to be tied back to the cost of actual living, which has also gone up. And there's lots of analysis that in the Halifax area, a living wage would be more like $19 an hour for those commissionaires that are, working as a pension bridge or not ready to retire. They might actually be, feeling some cost pressures even working at rising minimum wage levels. So what, how will you adjust to the $1 increase that is coming? And what does that mean in terms of, salary scales, I guess, for compensating people for experience and seniority in jobs?
Mr. Hamilton.
Yeah, unfortunately, because we really do operate not for profit, there is no margin for us to pass a pay raise on within our budget. We just need to have 220 difficult conversations with 220 clients who thought they were going to pay X and instead have to pay a little bit more if they want to stay ahead of the minimum wage. And I have a feeling that a certain number of those conversations will probably end in us having to part ways from those clients, a certain number. But the clients that enjoy working with Commissionaires specifically and recognize their value are going to step up, I think. It's just a long, slow process, and you've got to get inside the procurement processes of some large organizations. It's difficult and slow, unfortunately. Not a satisfying answer, I know, but...
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. And we move on to the Liberal Caucus. Mr. McKay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As an MLA, I know that eventually, if I don't retire, I will get fired. I'm like a hockey coach in that sense. You either retire or get fired at some point. Fortunately, I check off a couple of boxes here. I'm a failed retiree. I like that phrase. And I'm a former Army reservist. Sorry, was in Ottawa. I know there's a small Navy reserve there, but I was with the Cameron Highlanders. So I check off a couple boxes, so I may come knocking at the door sometime. I was looking at your website last evening, and one of the things that caught my eye was that your security consultants are certified protection professionals, and I was wondering if you could dig a little deeper into that for me, because that really caught my eye, and who gives the certification and what's involved in getting that certification?
Mr. Hamilton.
First, I'll jump back to your reference to the Cameron Highlanders. My great-grandfather was an early commanding officer of a predecessor in the 45th Battalion that went over the First World War, so I'm happy to see that. Okay, well, I'll ask after you. To answer your question, which I've gone blank on, I'm afraid. The certification is provided by ASIS, is the organization, the International Association of Security Industry Society, something to that effect. It is sort of the industry standard, and certified protective professional is a certification they provide and a credit. So not everyone in the organization has that, of course. That's sort of something you would get mid or late career, but our district managers, who are sort of our senior operational managers, typically have that.
Thank you. And Mr. McKay for supplementary.
One thing that struck me in your, I guess your unknown facts or not well-known facts, your retention rate, very high, not just for the industry, but perhaps for most sectors. And here in Nova Scotia, of course, we have challenges with rural employment. You have such a high retention rate. What would you attribute that to?
Mr. Hamilton.
I think it's really baked into the organization and who we reach and how we do it. We provide people with a familiar, comfortable work environment doing stuff they like to do. It gives them a sense of purpose. It's our special sauce. We're very fortunate to have a lot of the sort of people that we do, and we're very fortunate to be able to attract them. And I'm astonished every day I go around and meet commissionaires who have really interesting backgrounds and a lot of skill and dedication. When I compare that against what they are paid, I have to say I'm more than surprised. Shocked is sometimes the word, but it's, it really is. It's something to do with the organization and the way we work and what we offer them that keeps them coming back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. And I think it's a lot of pride in there as well. We move on to the PC Caucus and Ms. MacLellan again.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You spoke in your presentation about the South Shore, and that's part of my constituency. And you spoke of the challenges for veterans that are looking for employment with your organization in that area. How many, or approximately how many veterans would you have in the South Shore that would be looking for work with your organization?
It's difficult because we don't know.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Hamilton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's difficult because we don't know exact numbers until we start canvassing. We know anecdotally, so-and-so knows somebody who lives in Shelburne who's looking for work. And we do get applications sort of over the transom, unexpectedly, unsolicited, sort of from specific areas where you just don't have work. And we track them loosely, but we don't have exact statistics on that, I'm afraid.
Back to Ms. MacLellan for a supplementary.
Thank you. I'm assuming if you had those hospital contracts down through the South Shore with all of our lovely hospitals, you might be able to fill that void. My next question is, what is the, what do I do with it? What is the percentage of your business from provincial contracts?
Mr. Hamilton.
It's in sort of between 16 and 20% at the moment. I could follow up with the exact number, but yeah, it's relatively small.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. We'll move on to the NDP, Ms. Roberts again.
Thank you. I was, for a relatively short time, an executive director of a nonprofit organization at the point that we were registering to participate in WCB coverage. And I was interested in your remarks about the WCB system and I guess the options that you're weighing at this point in time, as well as what you perceive as a disadvantage to commissionaires when bidding on RFPs because of your mandatory enrollment in WCB. And I wondered if you could just share that a little bit more, because obviously that's where we're all, as MLAs, generalists, and I'm not an expert in WCB, so I was interested to hear that. I was interested to hear those remarks and interested to just understand a little bit more what you're weighing at this juncture in terms of continued participation with WCB.
Mr. Hamilton.
Yeah, I'm a generalist myself by background, and have had to become more of an expert in worker compensation than I had expected when I took the job. It's I think the challenges within WCB are well enough advertised, and this is not meant as a critique of anyone who works there, because I understand that they work within their legislation, and they have to deliver a program that they can't control in many respects. But what we have found, having priced it out, is that the cost of the commercial insurances that would cover all of the liabilities associated with workers' compensation insurance is significantly less expensive, to the extent that we could cover our commissionaires for any type of sickness or injury, not just work-related ones, for the same cost. So that was a surprising finding to us as well.
Thank you again. You did the supplementary, right? No, sorry. Ms. Roberts for a supplementary.
Thank you. And that is also surprising to me, given that you'd assume that sort of a universal, widely subscribed public program ought to be, or I would expect to be, the most affordable option available. So that's something to walk away with more questions about, I guess. But could you explain to me how you see your enrollment in WCB as being a disadvantage when bidding on contracts?
Mr. Hamilton.
Yeah, I suppose that we see it through two lenses. One is in terms of the return to commissionaires. So if we can offer them a more fulsome insurance program that provides them with a better benefit for the same amount of money, we want to do that. The other bit, in terms of a competitive disadvantage, is that there are a number of security companies working within Nova Scotia that are based, say, in Montreal or Vancouver, who have contracts here. They do not have to enroll in WCB. So that we effectively have a payroll tax in comparison to those other providers.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. We'll move on to the Liberal Caucus. Mr. Horn.
Thank you. I'm glad you're here today and appreciate what your conversations are about. I noted in one of your part of your presentations an initiative that you were trying to upgrade some of the values jobs with your commissionaires. And I'm just wondering what portion of the commissionaires that are more or less paid minimum wage or $1 above, how many are these valued type of specialties that they have for security reasons? For security would be one. I wonder if you can just comment on that.
Mr. Hamilton.
Yeah, the diversification areas, we refer to them. So of those four service lines, how much do the other three take up as compared to the traditional commissionaires is effectively what the question is. And it's less than 10% right now, I would say. So it's an area that we see growth in, and we want to be able to provide them as those veterans that want to access them release and join us. But there's sort of a commercial angle where we have to sort of go out and sell those as a product. But then there's the social mandate side of things where we have to find the people who meet our social mandate who want to fill those jobs.
Mr. Horn for supplementary.
All right, thank you. Do you work with the federal governments and forces to see if you can get employees in the region? Do you work with the federal side very much? Or is it just left to the individual, come to you?
Mr. Hamilton.
We're very proactive in our recruiting, so we liaise a lot right now with the military, actually, to identify folks who are releasing through, they have a process called the Second Career Assistance Network, the SCAN seminars that we participate in. The Military Family Resource Centers as well are one way that we reach out. We try to reach veterans really before they're veterans, when they're starting to think about what they might do when they get out of the military is really the time to do it. So that's how we spend a certain amount of our efforts targeting them.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Move back to the PC caucus. And Mr. Ryan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You mentioned earlier during your presentation about the retail outlet that you just opened up on, was it on Barrington Street? No. Yes. Is that a relatively new initiative and have other commissionaire organizations across the country been doing similar types of things?
Mr. Hamilton.
It's relatively new within the last 10 years. So as compared to an 80-year-old organization, it's new. But no, we just moved to Barrington a couple of months ago. We had previously been operating out of the Maritime Center on sort of the 14th floor, so it was relatively lower profile retail outlet. And now we're sort of expanding it because we want to reinforce success. We're seeing appetite for that sort of work.
Mr. Ryan. Oh, sorry.
It does happen elsewhere in the country as well, though. It's not just Nova Scotia that we're doing this.
Okay. Do you have a supplementary, another question? No? Thank you very much. We'll move on to the NDP caucus. Ms. Roberts.
I'm hearkening back to your map showing where you're working and where you're living. One of the things that I've been coming to understand as I am in this job a little bit longer is the extent of labor shortages, actually, particularly in rural Nova Scotia, where a number of industries, share through various channels that the availability of labor is actually a constraint on their operations. Have you experienced that at all in any of your contracts across Nova Scotia?
Mr. Hamilton.
Yes, is the short answer. It's definitely a tight labor market, and finding not just people, but good people with the right backgrounds and the right experiences who can get security clearances for the positions that require them is always a challenge. But that is the business we're in, effectively. In rural areas, I would suggest that we have relatively fewer challenges. So HRM is more of the difficulty for us at the moment. I think the salary and wage pressures you mentioned earlier, cost of living, plays a factor in that as well. In the rural areas, we don't note that difficulty as much, but it is certainly something that's been a feature of the last few years economically.
Ms. Roberts for a supplementary.
Thank you. And, you've already made reference to the wage rates, which are not, I guess you'd call them competitive, but, which are pressured, both by the rising cost of housing and food and everything else that people are having to pay. So harkening back to your 80% retention rate, other than sort of the culture of, that people feel good working for the organization, is there something else that you're offering people which kind of helps to explain the retention rate?
Mr. Hamilton.
We do offer other benefits as well, medical and dental benefits that are affordable and accessible is something we've rolled out recently. We've had life insurance for a long time. We're relatively within the security sector, which is not a sector that's known for great employment practices. I have to admit, as somebody who's worked in that sector in the private side, we are the standout better employer. So that's probably a good part of it. But I would suggest that if you really want to scratch the surface, it is because there is a big group of people who just know the Commissionaires, like the Commissionaires. They were in the military. They had always planned to join the Commissionaires, and then they did. And maybe they've got a pension, and they don't necessarily, they're not as worried about the financial pressures as long as they can live in their home communities and do something that gives them a sense of meaning. That's the big driver.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Move on to the Liberal Caucus, Mr. Jessup.
Thank you so much. Through the chair, I'm just wondering, perhaps Mr. Hamilton, if you can walk us through the application or the process whereby you either place or accept an individual requiring an accommodation.
Mr. Hamilton.
And it's a very good question. I would say the process is quite informal, and in many cases, the disability requiring accommodation is sometimes not identified at the time of hiring. Now, in the case of Fred and his dog Thunder, it would have been obvious to us. But it's very much an informal process. So when we take people in, we do sort of an initial skills assessment. They go on training, and in the course of their training, they'll be sort of spoken to, I guess, by somebody you might term a career counselor, sort of ask them what they're interested in, what their needs are, and it's at that phase where any sort of disability would be discussed or anything that needed to be accommodated. Whether it's a disability or not, there are some people who just want to go south for a couple of months every winter, and they want to be put at a site that allows them to do that. So, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Mr. Jessup for a supplementary.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. And unrelated to that, I had a question around your support for employees, I guess, working in some of these rural areas that are that don't necessarily have a major contract aligned with it. And I'm thinking, if in some instances I've seen in Alberta where people are picked up in a certain community by a bus and then transported to the job site, is there anything creative that you as an organization do to facilitate work for commissionaires who may live in some of those not red communities?
Mr. Hamilton.
I think we need to get a little bit more creative now, particularly as discussed. We are under pressure to find good, talented people from the existing pool. But we haven't been pressured enough to have to sort of come up with those creative solutions. I would suggest that for certain, I think, higher margin or better paying business lines, event security as opposed to static security, we would be able to sort of explore doing stuff like that, especially on a one-off basis, busing people in from rural areas or providing some sort of flexible work arrangements. I'd say the one thing that we offer that I suppose accommodates folks working in very rural areas is just a flexible work schedule. Allows them to say, hey, look, I can only do 3 days a week, or I need to be off for 2 months in the summer to help my brother at his farm, or whatever it may be.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Move back to the PC Caucus, Ms. MacLellan.
Thank you. Under this initiative slide, there's talk about the non-core policing and investigations, and you mentioned, and I think I may have missed it, about investigations and support to law enforcement. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. Does that mean that that commissionaires could possibly be looking into public complaints, that type of thing against officers? What exactly does investigations and support mean?
Mr. Hamilton.
And I guess I'll kick it off, and maybe
Okay.
Commissioner Graham can step in if he thinks I missed anything. But it could encompass any number of things. Investigation's obviously a very broad term, so what does that mean exactly? Well, in the security industry, it sort of means everything from doing a harassment investigation at a work site where there's an accusation of harassment, all the way sort of up to trying to find out what happened to the money that disappeared. And certainly at the high end of that spectrum would be things like police complaint investigations, which is not a typical line of business within the security industry at all, because I think most security companies would not be regarded as a trusted partner, trusted enough to engage in that sort of work. But because our folks have, we have investigators with major crime investigations backgrounds who have security clearances, it's something that we could provide, absolutely. And we are having those discussions and looking forward to furthering them.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Ms. MacLellan for a supplementary. You're fine. Thank you. We move on to the NDP. Ms. Roberts.
Thank you. Under your surprising facts, it states that because you're a Nova Scotia-based not-for-profit, we generate 20% more provincial tax revenue for every dollar, and we create 18% more employment for Nova Scotians. And I'm just wondering if you can break down those stats a little bit for me. I'm a huge fan of the not-for-profit sector, but I don't think I've seen them. I'm not entirely sure, like, what that math is. Yeah.
Mr. Hamilton.
And I'm not an economist either, so I'd be happy to share the economic impact assessment with the committee that breaks it down. Effectively, if I understand it correctly, there's two factors there. There's the not being based in Nova Scotia factor and the not being for-profit factor. Being based in Nova Scotia, I think the economic impact of that obviously is a little bit more tangible. We understand there's a headquarters of 40-odd people in Bedford, and they do things, and those salaries are here instead of Montreal or London or wherever they might otherwise be. So that accounts for, from what I understand, about half of the effect of those numbers. And being not-for-profit being versus for-profit, I suppose we're a unique not-for-profit in that we compete for work against for-profit companies. The way the shareholder structures and the way the money flows around that, and this is where it sort of gets into economic forecasting models I don't quite understand. It is because we're not satisfying shareholder profit that gets maybe paid as a dividend at a lower tax rate or in some other way. The money tends to flow in the communities more, and that's how the tax effect breaks out.
Just to add to that quickly, it is important to note
Miss
that
MacLellan.
it is important to note that the study was done with the provincial input-output model, so the numbers they'll speak the same language.
All right, I'm sorry. Miss Roberts again. Sorry.
I appreciate that. It's great to know that you have a 40-ish person headquarters in Bedford, but you are also part of a national organization in some capacity. So what services are provided to you at a national level, or how does that relationship work?
Mr. Hamilton.
Very little is done nationally, so we are a true federation. But we are a true federation in the sense that the standalone autonomous divisions really do run their own businesses. We do have we call Commissionaires National Office in Ottawa. It's an office of 5 people. It's effectively a representative office for liaison with the federal government, and that's about it. There's a certain amount of marketing support that happens there, but compared to the organization, that it's not a head office by any means. It's really a very small support organization.
Sorry. Ms. Hickey would like to add something.
Just
as
to
well.
supplement that, the national office is the owner of our brand, so the copyright of, our symbol, all of our branding. So some of that marketing effort is helmed at the national office.
Thank you, Ms. Hickey. And we move on to the Liberal Caucus. Mr. McKay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Did I hear in your preamble that you provide some services at correctional facilities? How does that work with our own public service employees? And I'm assuming your staff aren't unionized. And can you speak to how that works when you're in a provincial facility?
Mr. Hamilton.
For corrections is predominantly federal, so it's Corrections Canada. We do a certain amount of work with, I believe, one of the provincial corrections institutions, but in terms of how that breaks down and versus union versus non-union, they're not correctional officers by any means. I mean, they're doing the work of commissionaires at a correctional institution, which has led to sort of interesting things. They do engage, I guess, indirectly in the work of corrections officers. We recently had a commissionaire who found a shank that had been prepared and pre-positioned for use at a corrections institution. So the work is hazardous in many respects, but they are doing what you would consider to be sort of traditional commissionaire work. They're escorting contractors in particular.
Mr. McKay for supplementary.
In a completely different direction, with the ever-growing concerns of cybersecurity, is that an area that you're moving into that, probably higher-end jobs, higher-end contracts?
Mr. Hamilton.
We see it as a real potential area. There is a whole trade in the military of folks who do just that. So we would love to be able to provide work for those folks, but those folks also tend not to be the sort of veterans who have trouble finding jobs as well, and there's a lot of people looking at that area. Our sister division in Quebec has actually developed a cybersecurity capability, so we're talking with them about how we might be able to provide that here in Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Move back to the PC Caucus. Mr. Ryan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In relation to the security services provided by the Commissionaires, the focus has been basically surrounding retired veterans, retired former members of the police forces, what have you. Is there an opportunity, or do you have any instances where non-retired members of the police forces or active members are participating with Commissionaires?
Mr. Hamilton.
We do have instances of that, less on the police side, but more on the active member side. I mean, I myself, I guess, would be considered an active member of the military because I'm still in the reserve, and we have quite a number of reservists, active reservists who are in Commissionaires. We also do provide support for certain events, one-off events, particularly at peak seasons that are the sort of things that serving members might want to do on a weekend, for instance, because they want to be at this event. So we do have a certain amount of that as well. But of course, it would be subject to whatever their operational requirements are, and it can be difficult, obviously, to forecast months out their availability.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Mr. Ryan for a supplementary.
So I would.
Oh, sorry, Mr.
Oh, I'm sorry. Ms. Hickey would like to add something.
Just going to follow up on the little handout. There's a good example of the answer to the question that you just asked, where we have Private Diallo with the Princess Louise Fusiliers here in Halifax, so as a reservist, but also working as a commissionaire. So it's just one illustration of how currently serving members of the reserve force, for example, can be double-hatted in doing both roles.
Mr. Ryan.
No,
You're
I'm good,
done?
Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. And then move on to the NDP. Ms. Roberts again.
Thank you. I would be interested to hear from the members of the Board of Governors who are here in terms of, I guess, what motivates you to, I assume, volunteer with this organization. And I imagine that you may be, I find often people who are on boards are not on one board, but there's no shortage of places all the same that you could be lending your time and your experience. So, what is the motivation in being involved?
Do we start with Mrs. Hickey?
Thank you. The motivation for me, I think, really goes back to my own background. My father was in the British Navy during the war, served there, and then joined the Canadian Navy following his retirement. So I grew up with an appreciation for the military. I joined the Naval Reserve when I was in high school, just for a summer job, and thoroughly enjoyed it. And it taught me so much. It gave me an understanding of the ethos of military culture that I think speaks to many of the things that Jeff spoke about that causes people to stay in our organization. The sense of camaraderie, the sense of loyalty, the sense of belonging to an organization that is doing good in the community and for your country. It's all of those kinds of values that make me appreciate all of the work that is continuing to be done by our veterans, and makes me want to contribute back in some small way through volunteering on the board. It's just a very fulfilling organization to belong to.
Thank you, Ms. Hickey. And Mr. Graham?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Hard to, I could easily say ditto, but I would add to that the added dynamic of you meet such wonderful people that are committed through a sense of duty and providing service, and certainly throughout my career, I worked a lot with commissionaires, with Canadian Forces personnel, with other policing services and so on, and often in challenging and trying circumstances. And I guess it's an opportunity really to give back to people that I have an understanding about the commitments that they have made, how they've moved across the country, how they've disadvantaged their families many times, how their kids have gone through a lot of turmoil being in different schools. So if there's an opportunity to support them now and improve their lives, this is a wonderful organization for that. People have a great sense of belonging, and they have a great opportunity to continue to contribute, and they get a great sense of value from working. So I just tickle pink to be part of this.
Thank you, Mr. Graham. Ms. MacLellan, would you like to offer something?
Absolutely. I think my path is a little bit more winding and possibly less virtuous than my colleagues. And I'll try to keep it short. But as we approach the commemorative period, which for many of you would know, the commemorative period being for the Great War, so it would be 2014 to 2018, I was engaged to organize an incoming mission from Belgium. And so these were all Belgian people who were, coming to see what we were doing for the commemorative period. And I started through that process to learn a little bit more about our own military history, our very proud military history. And by way of that, I learned a lot about my own family. You don't have to scratch the surface very far on any of us to find a hero in your own midst. And so I was moved by that whole experience, and then to a point where I think my husband would say I became a bit obsessed with it, and started to look at how we commemorate and how we mark our own military history. And so I became very involved in the Army Museum. I co-chaired a project that I thought would be very simple, but became probably one of the most complicated things I ever did, which was the Last Steps Memorial Arch on the waterfront. And through that process, it's funny, I didn't think I would have a visual aid today, but I do have one. I hope everybody has an opportunity to read this. This is Nova Scotia's part in the Great War. I actually was thumbing through it last night because looking back to, the beginnings of supporting veterans when they returned home from wartime and from service and so on and so forth. And actually Nova Scotia has led the way historically in this country in supporting veterans. And so to be part of this organization at this stage in my life is, and through my own education, has been really, to say inspiring, it's an honor. And to be able to serve in this way is, it's really special. So I hope
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. And I thank you for that lovely question, too. We move on to the Liberal Caucus. Mr. Horn again.
Thanks. Just want you to go in a little more information about the 16 to 20% contracts are from provincial. I know quite a few of the commissionaires that work here, for instance. I'm just wondering, are they the long-term, not just them, but any other provincial contracts you have, are they kind of the long-term contracts? They seem to be happy most times, and I think I hope that's correct. As long as we're behaving, yes. But we do employ a lot in the province, and just want to know a little bit more on how long they stay and what kind of salary range they might make over a number of years and that sort of thing.
I got to smile. Mr. Hamilton.
Those are the long-term contracts. So when we say long-term, we mean sort of it's a permanent position. The person's there for a year or 2 years or 3 years on a contract side. They also tend to be long-term in the sense that the folks are the same faces you see year after year for many years. And that's particularly the case at Government House and Province House in particular. There's some folks who are very proud to be there. And I would say their motivation and pride to be there is perhaps not matched by the wages paid. And that's something I have to take a certain amount of ownership for because it's something the organization is allowed to creep up on us. So we're having those discussions now, but again, it's always in the context of a procurement organization that's designed to procure at the lowest cost. I'd certainly be happy to dig up those numbers and provide them if you wanted them, but not enough, I guess, is the short answer, and maybe the predictable one.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Mr. Horn for a supplementary.
I guess there's a lot of other people that are veterans that are going through your services. Just wondering what type of past backgrounds do they have or not have?
Mr. Hamilton.
Well, it takes a village. We take all comers in the sense that, obviously we're a veteran organization and it's about providing meaningful employment for veterans. And in order to do that, we have to be able to, in certain areas, round out the numbers to meet a specific client requirement. And that being the case, we have sort of a prioritization. So we would look for somebody who's a family member of a veteran, and beyond that, folks who have specific skill set in a specific area, or they have previous experience in the emergency services that aren't strictly speaking military or RCMP, but it's very relevant to what we do, and probably more relevant, I would think, to the province.
Thank you again, Mr. Hamilton. Move back to the PC Caucus, Ms. MacLellan.
Just one quick question. So when a veteran comes to your organization looking for employment, what is the process that they have to go through? Is it like they go through screening, training? If you could lay out the actual process, please.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Mr. Hamilton.
We place ads continuously and actually approach people on social media through LinkedIn who look like they might be retiring members or people who are thinking about leaving the military. We'll sort of get in touch with them proactively to sort of discuss what they may be thinking about. Once we get an application, they have an interview, they do a bit of an aptitude test and a skills assessment and then a needs assessment. From there, they would be programmed onto, we do the background checking, obviously, is a big step for us. And they'd be scheduled onto a course to do their training. The basic training is sort of 2 weeks long. Obviously, some people have trouble getting 2 weeks off straight to do the work, so we may have to sort of forecast them out a couple of months in advance until they're able to get the time. And on the course of the training, in parallel, they would start doing a security clearance application for the folks that we intend to employ at federal sites that require security clearances, which is the bulk of them in Nova Scotia because of all the defense facilities here. And the security clearance can be quite time-consuming, so that can impair the ability to employ people who are ready to be employed. And what we'll try to do is to employ them at commercial sites that don't require security clearance until that clearance comes through. But it's quite a pipeline. It can be a couple of months long, unfortunately, as much as we try to streamline it.
Then, thank you, Ms. MacLellan. We move on to the NDP, Ms. Roberts.
Thank you. Back to, or sort of following up on Mr. Horn's question about the provincial work that you do. And again, those pressures of meeting the minimum wage, increases. I guess other than what you're being paid for a contract, which may have been entered into a couple of years ago, I guess the other place where you could try to make up those minimum wage pressures would be through saving on your own operations. And I'm wondering, what if any space you have in your operations to make things more efficient. It seems like there's not much scope for asking the federal office to take work off of you. So anyhow.
Mr. Hamilton.
Yeah, and in terms of how much fat is there is the question I hear, and it's a legitimate one. It's surprisingly lean. I mean, it's a team of about 40 people that direct the employment of another 1,400. So there's not a lot to cut there, unfortunately. As much as I might like to be able to sort of free that up, you can only arrange the chess pieces on the board in so many different ways. In terms of generally, what we bill to our clients, we think about in terms of a markup on the basic wage that they get. It tends to be about 25% of what we bill to the client is not basic wage. Another 20% of that 25%, the 20% is payroll, cost of payroll directly. So it's CPP and EI contributions, WCB contributions, pay for statutory holidays that are earned but not worked. That comes to about 20% for us, and the remainder is the pure overhead. And of course, there are a lot of fixed costs there as well, just related to uniforms and trainings and stuff that we really can't pare back. So unfortunately, not much.
Ms. Roberts, for a supplementary, or are you okay?
Maybe not so much a supplementary, but sort of an unrelated question related to security clearances. I'm wondering about the barriers to employment that some Nova Scotians face due to previous convictions. What and I mean, even veterans can have something like that on their record. What, I guess, how many people are actually screened out of being able to meet those criteria?
Mr. Hamilton.
We don't track it in terms of how many are screened out for that specific reason, but you're right. It is it's almost, you could regard it as a form of a disability that could be accommodated through employment, and the security clearances only apply to certain of the federal work. So we do have a lot of work that could be done by somebody who had a prior conviction. Now we would seek, and I suppose if we satisfied ourselves that this is somebody we wanted to employ in a position of trust in a security role, that would be because it was a conviction that could be discharged, and we do provide support for discharging previous convictions. In fact, it is one of the services we offer through that ID Services criminal background check service. You can apply to have previous convictions discharged, so we would try to support them in that sense. But to a certain extent, clients just ask that there not be prior convictions on record for folks they employ, and of course we have to respect that. But you're right, I see the problem.
Thank you again, Mr. Hamilton. We've done about 7 questions from each of the caucuses, and I have Mr. McKay for the last one. Can we call it, and we'll, after Mr. McKay's question, we can have your final remarks, and then if you would like to leave after that, so we can do some committee business. Thank you so much. It's been amazing. Mr. McKay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to be sure that when you leave us today, that I fully understand what is your ask of me as an individual MLA, what can I do, and what is your ask of this committee? Can you help me with that?
Mr. Hamilton.
And I appreciate the question,
Yes.
and you'll notice that one of the slides was not things that we want you to do, because I suppose we saw this as an informative brief to tell you about some problems we're trying to solve for ourselves. So as individual MLAs, what can you do to support that? I guess be aware and supportive. If you hear somebody talking about these things that you hear commissionaires are doing, I guess be the informed person who tells them what I've told you today, and puts it into that context. In terms of what the committee can do to support, I think the question about the renewal of the right of first refusal, and what could be done there, I think a letter to the Minister of Veterans Affairs or even the Prime Minister would be very welcome.
Thank you very much. And I already wrote it down, and I'm sure one of my colleagues will bring this up in the business. And I truly want to thank you. And if you have a few more final remarks, please go ahead. Ms. Hickey.
Thank you very much,
Mrs.
Madam
Hickey.
Chair, and thanks to everyone for asking such informed and thoughtful questions. It's very much appreciated that you've shown an interest in our organization. Maybe if I could just add to the asks that Jeff has mentioned. You're all obviously in positions of influence with others within government, and you've heard Jeff speak to some of the problems that we have with RFPs and the criteria that are included on RFPs. So to the extent you're having any of these discussions with your colleagues, bear in mind that it is more than just the cheapest contract that is often the best contract. Bear in mind that when you're looking at hiring security services, that you're looking at getting the value of a veteran, and that's not necessarily the bottom dollar to pay for security services. So if you could just keep those thoughts in mind as you're having your discussions with your colleagues about influencing the content of RFPs, I think that would be, we would be hugely appreciative of that. And just before I leave, there was one part of the work that we do that we didn't really get a chance to touch on today. And if you could give perhaps Ms. MacLellan about 1 minute to speak about the work of our Veteran Support Committee, because in addition to providing meaningful employment for commissionaires, we also do some direct support of veterans initiatives throughout the province, and I didn't want to leave without you having just a short understanding of that.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you mentioned that. And Ms. MacLellan, please.
As soon as you said the value of a veteran, I was going to try and segue there somehow. So yes, I'm a very proud member of the Veteran Support Committee at Commissionaires Nova Scotia. And annually we do, and we know that our competitors, in talking about the RFP process and looking at, sort of how we evaluate, bidders on those types of things. One of the things that we do that we know that our competitors certainly don't do is support veterans in the way that we do. So just to give you a sense of the numbers in the past year, our committee dispersed $14,000 to medical facilities that support veterans in long-term care. We contributed $5,000 toward veteran support organizations and another $5,000 to commissionaires in urgent need. We also, and I know we all had an opportunity to participate in this, donated $7,500 towards commissionaires' families for education initiatives. And those are sort of numbers that, when we see them, they're numbers on a page. But I can say, having had the opportunity to be at some of these, check presentations, they're very specific to, for example, the in-facility care enhancements. They're everything from assistive aids for, obviously, people with disabilities, but also wheelchair accommodations, dental care. These are things that, would probably have never really crossed many of our minds until, that we're working closely with those organizations. We also see other things like extracurricular supports, and I can speak to that from a personal perspective because I had an opportunity to visit Tainamera in Glace Bay, which is a facility that supports veterans, and they had an accessible swing, which was the delight of many of the veterans who were there. We also support Pause for Thought, which is an important organization. And, we know that it provides, effective therapy, and other organizations, historical organizations like the HMCS Sackville Association. So we know that is, part of our mandate that we do, but we also would like to see in some way that's reflected in, the grading or the evaluation of these types of RFP processes.
Thank you again, and on behalf of everyone, I want to thank you. This has been really enlightening, and we will definitely try and do something to support you, and we're very grateful for your service. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Oh, we'll take a 2 minutes recess so that give them time to leave. Good. Bathroom recess. Oh, they're back. Where's Hugh? Order. Thank you, everyone. All right, what we have for business, we have a piece of correspondence. There is a request from the Admiral Barry Keeler to come back. I guess he was here. Oh, sorry. You have a copy of the letter, and they were here in 2010, and that was before my time. So, is everybody okay for inviting them? And I believe we do have. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Jessam.
I would just suggest that this is an appropriate conversation to be had at our next agenda-setting meeting.
That's right. Oh, I didn't finish. I said we have. The clerk told me that we have subjects already ready until the fall.
Okay.
So it will be in the next.
Awesome.
As long as everybody is okay with that, we will put it on the agenda setting.
Thank you, Madam
Okay,
Chair.
Thank you. And then, is there any other business you would like to speak about before we do the next meeting? Mr. Ryan.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. There we go. I probably don't need that. Back in June of this year, June 18th of 2019, and again in September of 17th committee meeting, there was discussion surrounding sending a letter to the Department of Health and Wellness requesting they look into changing the policy so that veterans and their spouses can stay together in long-term care. And I wanted to bring it to the committee to find out if this letter was sent to the department.
So I refer that to the clerk.
Okay.
I know we talked about it.
Well, I'm afraid you've caught me unprepared because the clerk of this committee retired last week, and I've just taken this one over. So I'm happy to look into it. I can report back at the next meeting.
Thank you very much. And if we don't, our next meeting is scheduled for April 21st from 2 till 4, if the House has risen by then. And the presentation will be from the Council Committee of the Northumberland Veterans Unit and the capacity and utilization of the unit. Is there any other questions? Or if there's none, then I call this meeting adjourned. Thank you very much.